I'm here at the home of Buford Pusser in McNairy County, Tennessee, the former sheriff of this place, and most certainly one of the most famous people produced by the state of Tennessee. And I wanted to tell his story because he's become something of a folk hero, a reputation I think is deserved. He was a very tough law enforcement officer, and it seems like several times he might have taken the law into his own hands. And it also seems like big parts of his story are exaggerated. For example, they said that he carried around a large stick to intimidate his opponents. And this was apparently invented for the movie, but every depiction you see of him, he's carrying basically this baseball bat. They also said that there were many attempts made on his life, and he was stabbed 7 times and shot 8. There were many attempts made on his life, and in 1967, his wife would actually be killed because of one of these. And we're actually going to visit the site where that happened a little bit later. Now, Buford Pusser was a fascinating character. He tried to join the Marines as a young man, and couldn't make it through BMT because he had medical problems. So he went into law enforcement after a short stint as a wrestler called Buford the Bull. So he's already got this reputation as a wild character. And a character is truly what he was. I want to come back one day and actually visit inside the museum because it's got a number of interesting exhibits on his life. It's closed today on Saturday, but a very, very interesting person. And again, I am of the camp where I believe that he was a folk hero. He was objectively, I think, a good man. So I guess that would make it subjective. But he was a good man, but there are parts of his story that aren't told very often that would draw into question some of his reputation, because nobody can be wholly good and nobody can be wholly bad. I think that he was mostly good. I think that he was the force that this county needed. Just in front of his house, you've got this memorial park dedicated to him with a pretty long and interesting description about his life as a young man who went off to become constable and then chief of police and then sheriff of this county, and he was elected several times. It's a fascinating history, and here you also have the depiction of him holding, again, his bat, his big stick, from walking tall. And I think it's a really interesting, nice, quiet town to visit here on the Tennessee-Mississippi border. And if you pan around here, you can kind of see the location. Visit Sheriff Buford Pusser Home and Museum. And there it is, right down the road. And just a few feet over the Mississippi state line in Tennessee was the infamous Shamrock Motel and the headquarters of the Dixie Mafia and the Hathcock family. And the story here I want to tell is that of Louise Hathcock, who was shot and killed by Buford Pusser some years after she killed her own husband in an effort to basically build the Dixie Mafia from the ground up. Now, the actual site of the Shamrock Motel was just off the road here. And as the story goes, at 2:45 in the morning, her husband began beating her, and she pulled a gun and shot 5 times, 3 shots of which hit him. And he died almost instantly, but later records would show that her nephew tried to enter into the room and was pulled off by her husband Jack's aunt. It was basically a door between the 2 rooms. It was a living quarters inside the Shamrock Motel, and later records would show and interviews would show that she was living in that room with a man 17 years younger than her, a man by the name of Towhead White. And there's a couple of pieces of evidence, paperwork and such, to suggest that she was going by the name White, and that she might have tied the Dixie Mafia to the White family, and basically that Jack was no longer competent enough to be leader of the Dixie Mafia. Now Louise, the queen of the Mafia, has to step up and just kill him herself. And basically this kid would have been in charge of the Dixie Mafia, but the Mafia, of course, all Mafia type organizations are very secretive. And several years later, the sheriff would come down and put an end to the queen of the Dixie Mafia's rule himself. And there's a lot of questions over whether or not the way he did it was justified. And sure enough, as I was told, all that's really left here is concrete. I'm sure the souvenir hunters have been through here many a time, picking whatever's left out. But yeah, it truly is just a concrete floor. I'm looking for something. Anything left over. Perhaps this slab over here is something. An old sewer grate. It's crazy to think of all the stories that came through here. I actually was talking to a guy in town, and he told me that he saw as a young kid a guy just slumped over the car. They had stabbed him, the Dixie Mafia, and folks would deal in stolen jewelry. It seemed to be that these hotels that had plenty of liquor available when, you know, the county in Mississippi was dry, people would come up, travelers would come through, and they would be given booze, and when they were drunk, if they had revealed that they didn't have anybody looking for them, they might have just been whacked and had their stuff stolen. So, yeah, it's kind of an interesting story, and it's interesting to think of how many people the Dixie Mafia might have actually killed here, and contrast that with claims that their stories are overly exaggerated. And this really is all that's left of what used to be along the border with Mississippi. Most of the seedy establishments and hotels would have been just up and down this road, feet inside of the state of Tennessee. And actually just up here to the right, where my truck is parked, was the Shamrock Motel. Literally on the state line. I always love seeing the differences in the roads. And this as well would have been an old pumping station, probably owned by the Hathcock family and the Dixie Mafia. And it's very interesting to think of Towhead White trying to basically team up with Louise, the queen of the Dixie Mafia. And I think it's interesting that Louise probably was using him as a symbolic gesture, whereas everybody kind of knew that it was Louise that was in charge. And that is probably why Sheriff Buford Pusser came down here and, in his own self-defense, shot her. And that happened right to the right, about 100 feet of where my truck is located. One of the most crucial factors in Buford Pusser's rise to power was the death of his wife, Pauline Pusser, who was assassinated by members of the Dixie Mafia. Now, as the story goes, it was August 12, 1967, and Buford received a call. He let his wife, Pauline, ride along, and then when they passed the New Hope Road Methodist Church, a Cadillac was waiting for them behind the church and began to follow them at high speeds with its headlights turned off. Keep in mind, again, this is the middle of the night on August 12th. And the Cadillac eventually pulled up beside them and opened fire, and basically immediately Pauline Pusser was killed, and Buford Pusser received at least 3 shots to the jaw. The doctor said 2 shots, maybe 3 to the jaw, and multiple shots throughout the rest of his body. He spent 18 days in the hospital, and when he got out, he accused the leader of the Dixie Mafia, a man by the name of Kirksey Nix. And what is known is that Nix was an assassin. He had ordered several people killed. It was very obvious he had actually teamed up with the mayor of Biloxi, Mississippi, to order a couple of them assassinated. Then he ordered a hit from prison in the 1980s. And even though Buford Pusser was never able to bring Kirksey Nix to justice, it was very obvious that the man was an assassin. And he was placed on permanent isolation after ordering this murder from prison. So when he received that call early morning, August 12th, the sun hadn't even risen, and his friend, Jordan, the owner of Jordan's place, just north of the Mississippi state line, about a mile, good friends with Buford. And actually, Buford goes to that bar all the time. And Jordan says, "Hey, Buford, there's a civil disturbance. Can you come and put a stop to it?" And Buford goes to his wife, Pauline, and says, "This is an open and shut thing. I walk in, I walk out. It's going to be real easy." And he takes her, and rather than follow the highway all the way down Old Highway 45, which was the easiest route, for some reason, they make a left turn on New Hope Church Road, where there is a Cadillac waiting for them behind the church with its lights off. Now, there is no reason for that Cadillac to have been there. If there were an ambush, it would have been along the highway. Who told that Cadillac they were coming? Nobody really knows. And some other facts which have been brought up, mostly by Buford Pusser, the other story, which is a Facebook page created by a Arkansas retired police officer. He says that blood splatter was found on the outside of the car, and that Buford Pusser had been very openly seen with another girl walking around town, somebody who would later become his girlfriend a few years after the assassination of his wife. And so all of these factors added together seem to suggest that I don't believe Buford killed his wife, but I believe he probably knew a little bit about what was happening. Like, he knew more than what he told the media. For example, he said Kirksey Nix ordered this, the leader of the Dixie Mafia, and Kirksey Nix was an assassin. And he did order many, many killings, oftentimes with the help of town mayors and judges. He was a man who was very well connected, but there was no evidence tying Kirksey Nix to it. And for some reason, Buford was never able to actually nab him on that charge. So I think that Buford knew something. and there was some reason, some rendezvous that brought him near New Hope Church, and his wife died in that altercation. I'm standing on the hill overlooking 559 Peach Street in Selmer, Tennessee, which is where, on Christmas morning, 1968, Buford Pusser shot and killed Russ Hamilton, a kind of infamous local figure. Now, the story here mostly comes from Buford Pusser, The Other Story, which is run by, it's a Facebook page run by a retired Arkansas law enforcement officer. And he claims that all throughout that morning, Buford Pusser was in phone calls with a woman that was his girlfriend that he'd been seeing since before the death of his wife. And this kind of comes into play a little bit later in the story of the shooting. And around this time, he received a call from Don Pipkins, who lived in the property on the left, and he rented it out to the tenant, Russ Hamilton, who lived on the right. And he said that they'd been drinking throughout the day, and that Russ Hamilton slowly grew violent and was threatening to kill him, and that Pipkins feared for his life. Well, Buford said, just call the Selmer Police Department, and they'll come take care of it. And he said, well, I can't do that because I already did, and the Selmer PD didn't want to do anything. Apparently, Russ Hamilton had a reputation as a cop killer. He had actually murdered a deputy sheriff in 1931 and beat his wife and mother-in-law to death and killed a man from Alabama. Now, how he escaped execution, I don't know, but he did his time for it. And because the sheriff was the only one that would respond, he came out, and as he pulled up, Don Pipkins walked out the front of his house on the left, leaving behind his wife and kids. And I think it's interesting, Buford Pusser, The Other Story, points out that if he feared for his life, why would he leave his family there? But regardless, he says that Hamilton invited Pusser in. And Pusser would later report to the media, he said, Hamilton didn't seem like a bad guy. He seemed like he'd changed after jail. He was only ever arrested a couple times afterwards for public intoxication, and he was a good enough character to pay off his debts on time and in installments because he was a very poor man. And so he invited Sheriff Pusser inside, and apparently he was calm, cool, and collected, sitting on the couch, reclining, when he reached for his revolver and fired 3 shots. The first one struck Pusser in the stomach. It kind of grazed his stomach. The second one whizzed by his head, and the third one struck the butt of his revolver. And Pusser pulled his gun and shot Hamilton several times, once square between the eyes in the forehead. Now, this was an open and shut case for law enforcement. Pusser immediately drove over to his girlfriend's house and called the district attorney to say what had happened, and everybody knew that Russ Hamilton was a cop killer and also very likely a serial killer, so nobody really investigated. And the fact that there was this odd love triangle and that he seemed to maybe have taken more of a vigilante stance against Russ Hamilton, it kind of stands out here. But it is very likely that Russ Hamilton fired off a couple shots. And it's an interesting story. It shows kind of the shaky nature of reality when talking about folk heroes like this. What's now the Dodge City Saloon off Old Highway 45 used to be called Jordan's Place, after its owner, Hollis Jordan. Now, there have been some people that claimed that this was connected with the Shamrock Hotel and the White Iris and various other establishments associated with the Dixie Mafia and the State Line Mob, but I don't really think this at all. In reality, they say that Sheriff Buford Pusser was good friends with Hollis Jordan, the owner of the old saloon, and this was also a mile further north of all the other establishments that were associated with the Mafia. So Pusser came in fairly often and basically struck up a friendship, because Hollis Jordan was a Marine in World War II, something that Buford Pusser desperately wanted to be. And he never was able to get out of boot camp, so he was coming here very often to have some drinks, and it turns out that maybe Jordan was paying a little bit of hush money to the sheriff because they were dealing hard liquor, but it was never really rated. And I'm sure that his friendship with the sheriff had something to do with that. Well, in 1971, apparently, Hollis Jordan got into a fight, and he was beating his wife, and his stepson, Tommy, who was 17, picked up a shotgun and shot him twice in the back, and his wife shot him twice with, I believe, a pistol, and he was buried down in Mississippi, thus ending Jordan's Place.
Well, when Dickie got killed, he run off in my grandmother and them hog pen and killed him. There wasn't no bridge or nothing like that around, I don't guess. But
Well, you said so your father built this saloon
Yeah.
right here,
yeah,
but the place that Jordan owned was right over here.
yeah,
And that was right near where the other sheriff died, right?
yeah, yeah. But I don't think Jordan wasn't built then. I don't think. I don't know. I was too young.
I just got finished talking with an awesome local character named Dudley, and he told me, living along this area and growing up here, he actually had a couple run-ins with the sheriff. You just saw him a couple of times because he was a kid back in the day. But he said that the sheriff, Dickie, who was the incumbent sheriff when Buford was running, died right here along the old side of the road on Old Highway 45. And up until pretty recently, there's a tree there with a big scar on the side of it. And folks, since then, most have moved out or forgotten where the tree was or which side of the road it happened on, but this is actually where it was. And he also said that, well, he related a couple stories to me. He was talking a little bit about Buford as a character who would intimidate local ne'er-do-wells. He said that there were 3 guys from Mississippi up at a beer joint right up the road here, and he said, I give you guys 5 minutes. You better be gone. And he comes back 10 minutes later and they're not gone. He immediately knocks 2 of them out, and the 3rd one he throws around the store, throws him into the back of the sheriff's car, and hits so hard that he pops out the other side. The door slams open, and he lands on the ground. So what kind of reputation does he really have here in the county?
Well, depends on what side of the law you're on.
I've heard both sides of the story.
Well, it depends on if you, I guess, padding his pockets a little or something. I don't know.
I feel like both sides were vigilantes, but
Yeah.
Buford
Yeah.
was a little bit more on the
Yeah,
chaotic good side, you know?
yeah, yeah. He was as tough as everybody thought he was. That's for sure.
And he also, Dudley, pointed out a couple sites to me. He said the old Dodge City bar is not Jordan's place. Dodge City bar was built as a home by his father, but it's since come to be associated with Jordan's place. In reality, Jordan's place would have been right here. You can see a little bit of the old driveway right there. And that was a bar frequented very often by Sheriff Buford. And at the height of his popularity, enjoying his status as a folk hero of the American South, on August 21st, 1974, Buford Pusser was making his way back home along this highway, having just finalized a deal to portray himself in Walking Tall 2. And you'll notice here, the road curves, and he careened off the side of the road to where I'm standing right now, and because of the curvature of the road, many locals said they think that his steering mechanism was probably tampered with. And you can actually see the memorial for him here, the sign. But what's more interesting to me is this memorial. And it's interesting how there's no text, nothing really talking about his life, because his death was such a contentious subject. And a lot of people think he might have been murdered, myself included. December 12, 1937, August 21st, 1974. Now, what's also interesting is that the sheriff before Buford Pusser took office, while Buford Pusser was actually running for office, a man named James Dickie died in a very similar auto accident on August 1st, 1964. And Buford Pusser at that time was running for sheriff, but this was the incumbent. So it seems that there have been a couple mysterious deaths in auto accidents around the time of elections or when someone's gaining popularity, and it could have been perhaps somebody who was trying to run for sheriff. It could have been the state line mob. It could have been the Dixie Mafia. Who knows? But a lot of people in McNairy County think that Buford Pusser's death was no accident. And it was along this stretch of the Buford Pusser Highway that he met his untimely end on August 21st, 1974. If I didn't make it clear in my last clip, the state trooper who was investigating his death and declared it an open and shut case and said he was drunk driving without a seatbelt was later elected sheriff of the same county. So it is interesting how many untimely deaths happened, how many suspicious circumstances were involved. While in McNairy County, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of law enforcement in this county in general. So I came out to the Purdy Cemetery. Now, Purdy, up until 1890, was the county seat of McNairy. But the problem was, even though it was set out in the 1820s, one of the earlier towns in Appalachia, they rejected the railroad, and the town of Selmer said you can build the railroad through here starting in the 1850s. And the railroad came and brought prosperity to Selmer, and most people would later move out of the town of Purdy. But early on in the history of this town, you had a police officer named Moore C. Wisdom, and he was apparently trying to bring a man by the name of Ward back into town. Ward was a gambler and a drunk, and he kept pulling sleight of hand to unfairly win bets and wagers. And Moore, as a constable, was also a Cumberland Presbyterian minister. And in 1834 at night, he goes and retrieves Ward from the woods after apparently Ward had swindled somebody and run off into the woods. Brings him back to town on horseback, and apparently this Ward fellow jumped off the horse and stabbed Moore about 6 times in the back. Ward, of course, immediately was captured, put in jail, and Moore was buried in the cemetery outside of town, the first law enforcement officer and minister to be killed in this part of Tennessee 2 years before the Trail of Tears began. The first sheriff to be killed in the line of duty in McNairy County, Tennessee, was Samuel Lewis, who was a captain in the Union Army in the Civil War. And you'll see throughout this cemetery there's many different Union Army graves. Eastern Tennessee, by and large, was incredibly pro-Union. In fact, in Scott County, Tennessee, people voted at over 95% to remain a part of the Union. But as the Union throughout the war sort of neglected to send them proper arms and training, a lot of people radicalized. And as the war was over, many freed black folks started thinking that now it was just about politics, whereas before and during the war, everybody talked about how it was a war over the right of slaves to live free lives. So after the war, Samuel Lewis, who had been a captain in the 6th Tennessee Cavalry, was out patrolling at a polling station. And this was during Reconstruction, when civil unrest was at its height. And a group of freed black men called Union League came out, about 30 of them, and basically a local pastor had come out, another black man that the newspapers identified as a radical, and said, please, there's no need for bloodshed. Well, as Samuel Lewis came up and calmly but firmly told them to go back to their homes, according to papers, he was shot. And Samuel Lewis's brother was right next to him, and he pulled out a pistol and he shot one of the leaders of this protest in the head. And the protest immediately dispersed. They went into the hills, and then they raided the town over the next few days. This is an interesting example of the type of civil unrest in eastern Tennessee at the end of the Civil War.